Welcome to Alexandria, where history, mythology, and cultures come alive through audiobooks. Please subscribe, like, and comment to support us.
Chapter 1. The Son of Aphrodite. If the events of Troy's destruction happened at all, they likely took place around the year 1200 before Christ. The poet Homer is believed to have lived around 900 before Christ, and the first written records of long compositions likely appeared around 600 before Christ. This means that the story of Aeneas, if it has any historical truth, was passed down by word of mouth for about 300 years before Homer turned it into poetry. Then, for another 300 years, people memorized and recited his verses before they were finally written down. Throughout this entire period, the main goal was not to preserve historical facts, but to entertain listeners with a dramatic tale. Because of this, the story cannot be trusted as a historical fact. However, it is still important for all well-educated people to know about it. According to the story, Aeneas's mother was a famous goddess named Aphrodite. The Romans later called her Venus. Unlike normal mortals, she was not born from a mother, but instead appeared mysteriously from sea foam that formed on the surface of the water. When she first came into existence, she emerged onto the shore of a nearby island, Cythera, which is located south of the Peloponnesus. She was the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. Her magical powers were so strong that when she first walked along the shore, beautiful plants and flowers instantly grew wherever she stepped. She was also unbelievably beautiful herself and had the power to make anyone who saw her fall in love. After leaving Cythera, she traveled by sea to Cyprus, where she stayed for a while, surrounded by the island's breathtaking scenery. There, she had 2 children, both beautiful boys, named Eros and Anteros. These children remained young forever. Eros, later known as Cupid, became the god of love given, while Anteros was the god of love returned. Aphrodite and her sons wandered between the heavens and the earth. Sometimes they appeared in their true forms, sometimes they took on disguises, and sometimes they remained invisible. No matter where they were always busy carrying out their roles, Aphrodite spreading love and desire among both gods and humans, Eros making people fall in love, and Anteros punishing those who refused to return affection. Eventually, Aphrodite and her sons arrived at Mount Olympus, the home of the gods. There, she caused great trouble by making gods fall in love with each other and with mortals on earth. In response, Jupiter, who ruled over all gods, used his power to make Aphrodite herself fall in love. She became enchanted by Anchises, a handsome young man from Troy's royal family who lived in the mountains of Ida near the city. The reason Aphrodite fell in love with a man from Mount Ida happened like this. One day, the gods and goddesses held a grand wedding. However, one goddess was not invited, and she became angry about being left out. To get her revenge, she planned to start an argument among those who attended. She had a beautiful golden apple made with an inscription that said, "For the most beautiful." Then she secretly threw the apple among the guests. The goddesses all wanted to claim it, leading to a fierce argument over who deserved the title. To settle the dispute, Jupiter sent the goddesses to Mount Ida, under the guidance of a messenger. There, a handsome young shepherd named Paris, who was actually a prince in disguise, was given the task of deciding who should receive the apple. Each goddess tried to persuade Paris by offering him a special reward. In the end, he gave the apple to Aphrodite. She was so pleased with his decision that she took Paris under her protection and often visited Mount Ida, making it one of her favorite places. While there, she met Anchises, a nobleman from Troy who lived in the mountains raising flocks and herds. When Jupiter made Aphrodite experience love for the first time, it was Anchises who captured her heart. She went to Mount Ida and lived with him for a while as his bride. Their son was Aeneas. However, Aphrodite did not reveal her true identity to Anchises. Instead, she disguised herself as a Phrygian princess. Phrygia was a kingdom in Asia Minor, not far from Troy. She remained in disguise for the entire time she spent with Anchises in the mountains. Eventually, she decided to leave and return to Mount Olympus. Before leaving, she revealed her true identity to Anchises, but warned him never to tell anyone. She said that if the truth about Aeneas's mother were ever revealed, the child would be struck down by lightning from the heavens. After Aphrodite left, Anchises was unable to raise Aeneas on his own. So, he sent the child to the city of Dardanus, located north of Troy, where Aeneas was raised by his sister. She was the daughter of Anchises and was already married and settled there. Aeneas lived with his sister until he was old enough to help care for animals. Then, he returned to the pastures in the mountains. Even though Aphrodite had left him, she never forgot her son. She watched over him constantly and stepped in to help or protect him whenever he faced danger. Eventually, the Trojan War began. However, Aeneas did not join the fighting right away. He felt jealous that King Priam of Troy seemed to favor other young men and believed that his own abilities were not valued. Because of this, he stayed in the mountains, focusing on his flocks and herds. He might have remained there for the entire war, but one event changed everything. Achilles, one of the strongest Greek warriors, led an attack in the countryside around Troy, searching for supplies. He reached Aeneas's land, found him tending his animals, and attacked. Achilles seized the flocks and herds and chased Aeneas and his fellow herdsmen away. They would have all been killed if Aphrodite had not stepped in to protect her son. The loss of his animals and the attack on his land filled Aeneas with anger toward the Greeks. In response, he gathered an army of Dardanians and joined the war. He quickly became one of the most skilled and fearless warriors. With the help of his mother, who always came to his aid in battle, Aeneas performed incredible acts of strength and courage. During one of the battles, Aeneas rushed into the heart of the fight to save a Trojan leader named Pandarus, who was surrounded by enemies and in great danger. However, Aeneas was too late. Pandarus was killed. Still, Aeneas fought bravely to protect his fallen friend's body. The Greeks attacked from all sides, but Aeneas moved swiftly, fighting off enemies in every direction. The Greeks soon changed their strategy. Instead of fighting him directly, they stood back and hurled spears, darts, and arrows at him. Aeneas used his shield to block the attacks for a while, but then one of the Greek warriors threw a massive stone at him. The stone was so heavy that it would have taken 2 ordinary men to lift it. The impact struck Aeneas in the thigh, knocking him to the ground. Dizzy and weak, he was completely vulnerable and would have been killed if not for his mother, Aphrodite, who came to his rescue. Aphrodite rushed to him and covered him with her magical veil, which made him untouchable. She then lifted him in her arms and carried him away through the middle of the battlefield, while the swords, spears, and arrows thrown at him became harmless under the protection of her veil. However, while saving her son, Aphrodite left herself exposed. Diomedes, one of the Greek leaders, saw her escape and hurled his lance at her. The weapon struck Aphrodite's hand, causing a deep and painful wound. Despite her injury, she did not stop but continued to flee, while Diomedes, satisfied with his attack, ended his pursuit. As she disappeared, he called out to her, mocking her and telling her to stay in her own world and not interfere in human wars again.
Flee, goddess. Run back to your golden halls, to your feasts and your idle lovers. The battlefield is no place for you, no place for soft hands that weave garlands and cradle whispered promises. You came to shield your son, but what did you expect? That warriors would lay down their blades at the sight of your veil? That blood and iron would yield to beauty? You have felt the bite of war now, the sting of a mortal spear, and yet you still flee as if Olympus will mend what you have suffered. But let this wound be your warning. Gods have no claim here. This is a realm for those who do not shrink from pain, for those who stand their ground. Go back to your temples, goddess of love, and leave war to those who do not fear its touch.
After carrying Aeneas to safety, Aphrodite, now weak and bleeding, fled to the mountains. She climbed higher and higher, reaching the misty clouds, where she was found by Iris, the goddess of the rainbow. Iris comforted her and led her further up the mountains, where they found Mars, the god of war. Mars was Aphrodite's brother, and when he saw her distress, he took pity on her. He lent her his chariot and horses so that she could return home. Aphrodite climbed into the chariot and Iris took the reins, guiding the horses through the air toward Mount Olympus. There, the gods and goddesses gathered around Aphrodite. They treated her wound and expressed their sympathy for her pain, while also complaining about the cruelty of humans in war. This is how the ancient story of Aeneas and his mother is told. Later in the Trojan War, Aeneas faced a powerful enemy, Achilles, the greatest warrior among the Greeks and the champion of their army. The two forces lined up for battle, leaving an open space between them. In this space, Aeneas and Achilles stepped forward, preparing for a one-on-one fight while both armies and countless spectators watched. There was intense excitement and anticipation for the duel. Aeneas was famous for his extraordinary strength and courage, and everyone knew that his mother, Aphrodite, was always there to guide and protect him. However, Achilles had an even greater advantage. He was nearly invincible. When he was a baby, his mother, Thetis, had dipped him into the magical waters of the river Styx, which made him immune to injury. Every part of his body that touched the water became indestructible. However, Thetis had held him by his ankles when she dipped him in, so his ankles remained vulnerable. This was his only weakness. Achilles also carried a magnificent shield, which his mother had specially made for him. The shield was crafted with 5 layers of metal, brass on the outside, gold in the center, and another mysterious metal between them. It was beautifully decorated with intricate designs. Even though Achilles was nearly invincible, his mother still gave him the shield for extra protection when he left home to fight in the Trojan War. The two armies watched closely as the two great warriors stepped forward to face each other. Even the gods and goddesses from their heavenly homes above looked on with great interest. Some supported Aphrodite and felt sympathy for her son Aeneas, while others favored Achilles. When Aeneas and Achilles met in the open space between the armies, they did not attack immediately. As was common in such situations, they first stood and studied each other, exchanging looks of anger and challenge. Finally, Achilles spoke first.
What do you hope to gain? Even if you survive and save Troy, you will never be king. I know you claim royal blood, but King Priam has many sons who are the rightful heirs. You will never rule. And besides, how can you even think of fighting me? I am the strongest and bravest of all the Greeks, and I have the favor of the gods.
Achilles then proudly spoke of his noble ancestry and boasted of his strength and superiority. Aeneas responded with just as much confidence.
You speak as if fate is yours to command, Achilles, as if the gods themselves bow to your will. You taunt me with my lineage as if a man's worth is measured by a throne he may or may not sit upon. But I do not fight for a crown nor for empty titles. I fight for my people, for my land, and for the honor that only the battlefield can grant. You boast of your strength, of your divine mother's gifts, but do not think yourself the only one with godly blood. I, too, am born of the gods. My mother, the goddess of love, has shielded me, just as yours has armored you. But let us not waste breath on words, Achilles. The will of the gods is beyond our reckoning, and only the clash of steel can decide whose strength is greater. If you believe yourself invincible, then stand before me now and let the gods judge which of us truly deserves victory.
Instead of wasting time with words, Aeneas acted, hurling his spear at Achilles with all his might. The spear struck Achilles' shield with tremendous force. It pierced through 2 layers of metal but stopped when it reached the golden center plate. The spear fell harmlessly to the ground. Achilles immediately retaliated. He threw his own spear with all his strength. Aeneas crouched low, holding his shield high above his head and bracing himself for impact. The spear struck the upper part of Aeneas' shield, pierced through it, and continued its path just above his back before plunging deep into the ground behind him. It stood there, still quivering from the force of the throw. Aeneas crawled out from beneath it, his face filled with shock. Without hesitation, Achilles drew his sword and charged forward, ready to fight hand to hand. Aeneas, recovering from his near miss, grabbed an enormous stone, so heavy that, according to Homer, it would take 2 ordinary men to lift it. He prepared to throw it at his approaching enemy. But before the fight could continue, something unexpected happened. The gods had been watching the battle closely. Some supported Aeneas, while others stood by Achilles. Neptune, the god of the sea, was on Aeneas' side. When he saw that Achilles was about to strike, he decided to intervene. In an instant, Neptune covered the battlefield with a thick, supernatural mist, making Aeneas disappear from Achilles' sight. Then, Neptune pulled Achilles' spear from the ground and removed it from Aeneas' shield. He dropped the spear at Achilles' feet. Finally, he lifted Aeneas into the air, completely invisible to those on the battlefield, and carried him away over the heads of soldiers and horses. When the mist cleared, Achilles looked around and saw that Aeneas was gone. His spear lay at his feet, but his opponent had vanished.
Hello? If you enjoyed our audiobook, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I need your support to bring more audiobooks to you. Thank you in advance for your support.
Chapter 2. The Fall of Troy. After the final conquest and destruction of Troy, Aeneas, during his travels, stopped in Carthage on his way to Italy. According to the ancient story, he gave the following account of how the city was captured and how he escaped. One day, after the war had lasted for a long time with many battles, the guards on the walls and towers of Troy noticed unusual movements in the Greek camp. The Greek soldiers seemed to be preparing to leave. Tents were taken down, and men were moving back and forth, arranging weapons and supplies as if they were getting ready to transport them. A fleet of ships was gathered along the shore, which was not far away, and there was a lot of activity on the beach, suggesting that the Greeks were preparing to sail away. Soon, the news spread through the city that the Greeks had finally grown tired of the long war and were making preparations to leave. The Trojans watched closely from the city walls, hoping it was true. Finally, to their great joy, they saw the Greek camp being taken down completely. One by one, the different groups of soldiers left and boarded the ships, which then sailed away. When it became clear that the enemy had truly gone, the Trojans opened the city gates. A large crowd of people, soldiers, citizens, men, women, and children, poured out of the city to explore the abandoned Greek camp and celebrate their departure. The first thing they noticed was a huge wooden horse left behind in the camp. The Trojans gathered around it, amazed and full of curiosity. Aeneas, in telling the story, said that the horse was as large as a mountain. However, since the Trojans later pulled it into the city using ropes attached to its neck instead of its legs, which would have been more practical if it was truly enormous, the comparison to a mountain must have been an exaggeration, or perhaps he used the phrase figuratively, much like people today say that ocean waves are mountain high, even though waves in the worst storms rarely rise more than 20 feet. Regardless of its exact size, the horse was big enough to impress and confuse everyone who saw it. The Trojans stood around it, wondering why the Greeks had built such a thing and left it behind. After their initial amazement, the Trojans began discussing what they should do with the horse. Many different opinions were shared. The commander,
"Brothers, we have fought bravely for many years, and today the gods have granted us triumph. Look upon this gift, this monument to our endurance. Why else would the Greeks leave behind such a grand structure unless it were meant for us? This is no trick. This is an offering, a sign of their surrender, a tribute to our strength. Let us not waste time with suspicions. Instead, we shall honor the gods by bringing this wooden colossus into the city and dedicating it to Athena. Let it stand in the temple as proof of Troy's might, so that future generations may look upon it and remember this day of victory."
the leader who suspected a trap.
Fools, have you forgotten who we are dealing with? These are Greeks, the masters of deception, the architects of ruin. Have they not schemed against us from the very beginning? And now they leave us this great wooden beast as a parting gift? Do not be so blind. This is no tribute, it is treachery. What do we truly know of what lies inside? I say we do not take such risks. If this is meant to be a trap, we shall not give them the pleasure of springing it upon us. Bring wood and oil, and set this horse ablaze. Let the fire consume whatever secrets the Greeks have left behind.
The one who demanded to uncover the truth.
Wait. Why destroy something before we even understand its purpose? If the Greeks have left us a trick, then we should uncover it for all to see. If this horse hides enemies within, what better way to expose them than to cut it open with our own hands? If it is empty, then we will know we acted wisely. And if it is truly an offering, then we shall decide what to do with it afterward. Let us not act blindly, neither with foolish trust nor reckless fear. Bring axes and tools, and let us open this wooden beast before we decide its fate."
At that moment, a Trojan leader named Laocoon arrived. He was strongly against taking the horse into the city and warned that it could be a trick. To show his suspicion, he threw his spear at the side of the wooden structure. The spear struck the wood and made a deep, hollow sound. It is impossible to know what the Trojans would have ultimately decided because, at that moment, something unexpected happened that changed everything. A group of peasants and shepherds suddenly arrived from the mountains, shouting loudly as they dragged along a Greek prisoner they had captured and tied up. The Trojans gathered around in excitement, shouting angrily and eager for revenge. Many wanted to kill the prisoner immediately. The captive Greek, terrified, begged for mercy, crying out in desperation. Sinon's suffering, along with his desperate pleas, eventually softened the hearts of his captors. The Trojans, who had been ready to kill him, calmed down and became curious to hear what he had to say. They began questioning him, and he responded. He told them that his name was Sinon, and that he was a fugitive, abandoned by his own people, the Greeks, who had planned to kill him. He explained that the Greek leaders had wanted to end the war and leave Troy for a long time. However, every time they tried to set sail, strong winds and rough seas forced them to turn back. Confused and frustrated, they sent messengers to consult the oracle of Apollo to understand why the gods were preventing them from leaving. The oracle gave them a terrible answer. It said the Greeks could not leave Troy unless they first made a human sacrifice to appease the gods. This victim, the oracle said, would be chosen by Apollo himself. When the Greeks heard this, they were terrified. No one knew who would be chosen, but their leaders were determined to follow the oracle's command. Ulysses ordered Calchas, the high priest of Apollo, to reveal who should be sacrificed. For 10 days, Calchas remained silent, waiting for a divine sign. Finally, he announced that the chosen victim was Sinon himself. Upon hearing this, the Greek soldiers were relieved that they had not been chosen. They eagerly prepared for the ritual. A sacrificial altar was built, and Sinon was dressed in ceremonial robes. A garland was placed on his head, as was the custom before a sacrifice. But just before the ritual could take place, Sinon managed to escape. He broke free from his restraints and ran into a marsh near the shore, where he hid in thick bushes until the Greek fleet finally left. Weak, starving, and alone, he wandered the land until he was eventually found by local shepherds, who captured and tied him up. As Sinon finished his story, he cried bitterly. He told the Trojans that they would likely kill him, and even if they spared him, the Greeks would surely punish his family when they returned home. His words were full of misery and despair. Sinon spoke with such emotion and sincerity that the Trojans believed every word. His grief seemed real, and his suffering appeared genuine. The Trojan leaders felt pity for him and decided to spare his life. Priam, the elderly king of Troy, was present among his generals. Moved by Sinon's words, he ordered his captors to untie him so that he could stand before them as a free man. He also spoke to Sinon in a gentle and reassuring way.
Priam said, "Forget your countrymen. They are gone. From now on, you will be one of us. We will take care of you. And now tell us, what is this great wooden horse? Why did the Greeks build it, and why did they leave it here?"
Sinon, acting grateful for the kindness shown to him, pretended to reveal everything. He told the Trojans that the Greeks had built the wooden horse as a replacement for a sacred statue of Pallas, a divine image they had stolen from Troy. According to him, the Greeks regretted taking the statue and believed they had angered the gods. To make up for this, they built the wooden horse as a sacred offering. Then, Sinon cleverly explained why the horse was so enormous.
The Greeks built it this large so that you Trojans would not be able to bring it inside your city. If you did, you would receive the same divine protection they once had. They wanted to make sure you could never benefit from its magical power.
The Trojans listened with deep interest to everything Sinon said and quickly believed his story. He spoke with such convincing emotions, showing grief and despair about his misfortune, that no one doubted his words. Those who had first wanted to destroy the wooden horse completely changed their minds. Instead of seeing it as a threat, they now believed it was a sacred object, something to be honored and brought inside their city. Any remaining doubts they had were completely erased when something shocking happened. The event was seen as a divine sign, a punishment for Laocoon, who had struck the wooden horse with his spear. The Trojans had decided to offer a sacrifice to Neptune, the god of the sea. To choose who would perform the ritual, they drew lots, and the responsibility fell upon Laocoon. As he began preparing for the ceremony with his 2 young sons, something terrifying happened. 2 enormous serpents suddenly appeared from the sea. The creatures swam across the waves, their heads raised above the water, then slithered onto the land. They moved quickly across the plain, their bodies shimmering in the sunlight, covered in brilliant spots. Their eyes glowed, and their forked tongues flickered as they advanced, hissing and spreading fear among the watching Trojans. The people panicked and ran away, but the serpents ignored everyone else. They went straight for Laocoon's 2 sons. The monstrous snakes wrapped around the children, twisting their bodies tightly around them. The boys screamed in pain, but they were completely trapped in the serpent's coils. Laocoon, who had been standing a short distance away, rushed to save his children as soon as he saw what was happening. He grabbed a weapon and ran toward them. But instead of rescuing them, he became another victim. The serpents attacked him, wrapping their powerful bodies around his neck and chest. They squeezed him tightly while still holding his sons in their deadly grip. The giant snakes lifted their heads high above their victims, hissing in triumph, as Laocoon and his sons slowly lost their strength. When their victims were finally lifeless, the serpents uncoiled themselves and slithered away. They went to a nearby temple and curled up under the statue of a goddess, as if they had completed their task and were now resting. The tragic story of Laocoon became famous in later times because of a statue that was created to represent this terrible event. The statue was discovered about 300 years ago among the ruins of an ancient building in Rome. The existence of the statue had already been mentioned by the Roman writer Pliny, who described it while it was still standing in the city long ago. He said it was created by 3 artists, a father and his 2 sons, who worked together with great skill and effort to carve it from a single block of marble. The statue showed Laocoon, his 2 sons, and the 2 serpents entwined together, struggling in their final moments. After the fall of Rome, the statue was lost for many centuries. People only knew about it through Pliny's description. However, it was finally discovered again, buried beneath the ruins of the same building where Pliny had seen it. Once found, the statue immediately became one of the most admired sculptures in the world. It was taken to the Vatican, where it remains today. The owner of the land where it was found received a large reward. Since then, countless drawings and copies of the statue have been made, and the original is now considered one of the greatest sculptures in history. Laocoon is at the center of the scene, with the serpents coiled around him as he struggles in terror and pain, desperately trying to break free. His face is filled with agony. One of the serpents has bitten one of his sons, and the boy is collapsing from the effects of the poison. The other boy, overcome with fear, is trying hopelessly to free his foot, which is tightly wrapped in the coils of the second serpent. The entire scene is both horrifying and powerful, yet at the same time it has a strange beauty that captures the attention of all who see it. This combination of tragedy and artistry has made it one of the most admired works of sculpture in history. Returning to the story, the Trojans saw this shocking event as a sign from the gods. They believed Laocoon was being punished for striking the wooden horse with his spear, and they became even more convinced that the statue was sacred and must be treated with respect. Without any more doubts, they decided to bring it inside the city. Preparations began immediately. The Trojans lifted the massive horse from the ground and attached wheels or rollers to its feet to help move it. Long ropes were tied around its neck, and large groups of soldiers and citizens lined up to pull it forward. A grand procession was arranged. Leading the way were army generals and high-ranking officials of the city. Behind them marched groups of boys and girls, dressed in beautiful wreaths and garlands, singing sacred hymns to mark the occasion. Since the wooden horse was too large to pass through the city gates, the Trojans tore down part of the city wall to create an opening wide enough to pull it through. When everything was ready, the ropes were pulled, the signal was given, and the massive structure began to move forward. Though there were many difficulties and delays, they finally succeeded in placing the horse inside the city, in the courtyard of a large public building. After that, they rebuilt the wall, and as the day came to an end, night fell over Troy. The people, satisfied with their work, returned to their homes and went to sleep. Soon, the entire city was quiet, except for the guards who remained at their posts at the gates and on the walls. Meanwhile, the Greek fleet, which had pretended to leave, had not gone far. Instead of sailing home, they had hidden on the nearby island of Tenedos, only a short distance from the shore. They waited there all day. As soon as night fell, they sailed back to the mainland, moving silently and carefully. The Greek soldiers secretly landed and approached the walls of Troy under the cover of darkness. Inside the city, Sinon, who had tricked the Trojans into believing his story, had been pretending to sleep. But once the city was silent, he rose quietly and crept through the streets to the wooden horse. There, he found a hidden door in the side of the structure and opened it. A group of armed Greek warriors who had been hiding inside climbed out one by one. Once they were on the ground and had put on their armor, they quickly moved toward the city walls. They attacked and killed the Trojan guards, who were completely taken by surprise. Then, they rushed to the city gates, unlocked them, and threw them open. Outside, the entire Greek army was waiting in the darkness, ready for the signal. Now that the gates were open, they charged into the city, and Troy's final night had begun. Aeneas was asleep in his house while all of this was happening. His home was in a quiet and isolated part of the city, but he was suddenly woken up by the distant sounds of shouting and fighting. Jumping from his bed and quickly putting on his clothes, he climbed to the roof of his house to see what was going on. From there, he saw flames rising from several buildings in the part of the city where the Greeks had entered. He listened carefully and could clearly hear men shouting and the sound of trumpets sounding the alarm. Without hesitation, he grabbed his armor and rushed into the streets, shouting to wake up the people around him and calling on them to take their weapons and fight. As Aeneas ran through the streets, he suddenly saw a Trojan friend named Pantheus rushing toward him. Pantheus looked completely terrified and confused. He was holding the hand of his young son, who was pale with fear. Aeneas stopped him and asked what had happened. Pantheus, breathing heavily, managed to explain in hurried, broken words.
Aeneas, it is over. The city, our beloved Troy, is no more. The Greek warriors hidden inside that cursed wooden horse have emerged. They waited until the dead of night, until all were asleep. And then they struck. They cut down our guards without a sound, slit their throats like helpless lambs, and threw open the gates. The entire Greek army has poured inside. The streets, gods help us, the streets are filled with them. They have sealed every passage, leaving no escape. The temples are burning, and homes crumbling to ash. Blood runs through the alleys, and the screams of the dying drown out even the gods. There is no saving Troy. Everything is lost.
Hearing this, Aeneas and the men who had gathered around him were filled with anger and desperation. They knew they had no chance of winning, but they decided to fight to the death, determined to take as many of their enemies with them as possible. They rushed forward, using the light from the fires and the distant sounds of battle to guide them through the dark and smoky streets. As they ran through the city, they found themselves in the middle of horrifying scenes of destruction, the kind that happens when a city is being looted and burned in the middle of the night. They came across a group of Greek soldiers, fought them fiercely, and killed them. Then, they took the armor from the fallen Greeks and put it on, hoping to disguise themselves so they could move through the enemy ranks undetected and attack smaller groups by surprise. They saw Princess Cassandra, the young daughter of King Priam, being dragged away by Greek soldiers from a temple, where she had tried to seek refuge. Aeneas and his men tried to rescue her, but suddenly they were attacked from two sides, by the Greek soldiers holding Cassandra and by other Trojan warriors who mistook them for enemies because they were wearing Greek armor. They saw the royal palace under attack. The Greeks had formed a tortoise formation, a tactic where soldiers held their shields above their heads like a protective shell and were using it to climb the palace walls and break in. The entire city was in chaos. The fires lit up the streets with a frightening red glow, while screams, smoke, and the sounds of battle filled the air. It was a night of absolute terror and confusion. Aeneas watched the attack on the royal palace from the top of a high building where he had climbed to get a better view. There was a tall, narrow watchtower nearby, built to allow guards to see the entire city and even the sea in the distance. Aeneas and the Trojans with him cut the tower at its base and pushed it over, crashing it down onto the Greek soldiers below. Many Greeks were crushed, and their tortoise formation, a shield-covered military tactic used to break into strongholds, was destroyed. However, the Greeks quickly formed a new tortoise. Some climbed the walls, while others smashed the gates with battering rams and siege weapons. The palace, the last stronghold of Troy, was soon broken open, allowing the raging enemy soldiers to pour inside. From the rooftops, Aeneas and his companions saw a horrifying scene. As the palace walls collapsed under the powerful blows of Greek siege weapons, the inside of the palace became fully visible, lit up by the fires spreading across the city. Inside, the terrified screams of people filled the air. The palace halls, once grand and peaceful, were now full of panic and chaos. Anyone who dared to look down could see Trojans running for their lives, men trying to fight, young women clinging to altars for protection, and mothers desperately searching for places to hide their children. King Priam, who was old and weak, was awakened by the terrible noise. Despite his age, he put on his armor and prepared to fight. However, his wife, Queen Hecuba, begged him to stop. She knew the battle was already lost, and that fighting would only anger the Greeks more, leading to certain deaths. Instead, she convinced him to put down his weapons and go with her to an altar in one of the palace courtyards. This altar was a sacred place, where no one should spill blood, not even enemies. Hecuba hoped that if they stayed there, the Greeks would respect the gods and spare their lives. Priam reluctantly agreed and followed her to the altar. This plan might have worked, but then something terrible happened. As the king and queen sat by the altar, one of their sons suddenly ran toward them. He was bleeding heavily from wounds, and Greek soldiers were chasing him. The young man collapsed at his parents' feet, dying in a pool of his own blood. Priam, overcome with grief and rage, stood up in fury. He grabbed a javelin, raised his voice in anger and curses against his son's killers, and hurled the weapon at the Greek leader. But the javelin bounced off the enemy's shield, causing no harm at all. Instead of stopping the Greeks, Priam's attack only angered them more. The Greek commander rushed forward, grabbed the old king by the hair, and dragged him across the floor, slipping in his own son's blood. He pulled Priam up to the altar, lifted his sword, and plunged it deep into the king's body, burying the blade to the hilt. He then threw Priam's lifeless body onto his dying son. With King Priam dead, all hope for Troy was gone. The city was completely under Greek control. The palace was destroyed, the royal family slaughtered, and the last defenders defeated. The Trojans who remained knew there was nothing left to fight for. Chapter 3. Seeking the Promised Land. From the top of a nearby building, Aeneas watched as the palace fell and King Priam was killed. He immediately realized that all hope was lost and that his only concern now was saving himself and his family from the destruction of the city. He thought of his father, Anchises, who was old and weak, about the same age as Priam, whom he had just seen murdered. He also thought of his wife, whom he had left at home, and his young son, Aeneas. A horrible fear struck him. What if the Greeks had already reached his house? What if they were attacking his family right now? Determined to reach his home immediately, Aeneas looked around to see if any of his companions were still with him. There was no one left. Some had jumped from the walls and escaped into other parts of the city. Some had fallen and died in the fires below. Others had been hit by arrows and spears, falling lifeless into the streets. The Greeks had also left this part of the city after destroying the palace, moving on to attack other areas, shouting in victory as they went. Aeneas listened as their voices faded into the distance, realizing he was now completely alone. Aeneas carefully climbed down from the ruins and made his way through the burning city, moving quietly and cautiously to avoid the dangers around him. He headed toward his home, desperate to save his wife and son. As he moved through the shadows of the ruins, he spotted a figure hiding near an altar. He stopped and looked closer. It was Helen. Helen was a Greek princess and the former wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. Years ago, she had run away to Troy with Paris, the son of King Priam. This event had started the entire war. At first, Menelaus and his allies came to Troy to demand Helen's return, but Paris refused. Enraged, Menelaus returned to Greece and gathered a great army to invade Troy and take her back by force. Because of this, many Trojans blamed Helen for the terrible war that had destroyed their city and killed their people. Aeneas, already filled with grief and rage, now burned with anger when he saw Helen trying to hide. He saw her as the cause of all their suffering, the reason his home, his city, and his people were being wiped out. Hatred consumed him. "I will kill her," he thought as he rushed toward her hiding place. He hesitated for a moment. There was no great honor in killing a woman. But then he convinced himself.
There is no great glory, it is true, in wreaking vengeance on a woman, or in bringing her to the punishment which her crimes deserve. Still, I will kill her, and I shall be commended for the deed. She shall not, after bringing ruin upon us, escape herself, and go back to Greece in safety, and be a queen there again.
As Aeneas rushed forward with his sword in hand, ready to strike Helen, his path was suddenly blocked. In front of him stood his mother, the goddess Aphrodite. She reached out, took his hand, and spoke in a calm and soothing voice, urging him to let go of his anger.
Helen is not the cause of Troy's destruction. The fall of the city was decided by the gods, and no human could have prevented it. It is useless to fight against fate or seek revenge on a person who has no control over what happened. Forget about Helen. Think of your family. Where is your father, your wife, your young son? Even now, while you waste time here in anger, they are in great danger. The city is full of enemies, ready to kill them. Go to them, save them. I will be with you, though unseen, and I will protect you and your loved ones from harm.
As soon as Aphrodite finished speaking, she disappeared. Aeneas, realizing his mother's warning, immediately turned away from Helen and ran toward his home. As he moved through the burning streets, he noticed that his way seemed clear. Armed enemies passed by without seeing him, and dangers seemed to move aside. He now knew his mother was truly guiding and protecting him. When Aeneas finally reached his house, the first person he saw was his father, Anchises. Breathing heavily from his rush through the city, Aeneas told his father,
Troy is lost. We must escape. We need to flee to the mountains before it is too late.
But Anchises refused to leave.
You are young. You have a future worth saving. But I am old. My life is nearly over. I will not run away only to spend my last days in misery as an exile. If the gods wanted me to live, they would have saved my city. My home is here. I will stay and die with it.
Anchises turned away, his face full of sorrow, refusing to be convinced. Aeneas's wife, Creusa, joined him in begging his father to leave, but Anchises would not change his mind. Desperate, Aeneas made a bold decision.
If you stay, I stay. If we must die, we will die together.
He called for his armor, preparing to go back into the streets and fight until the end, determined to take down as many enemies as possible before he was killed. But just as he was about to leave, Creusa ran to him in tears. She fell at the doorway, holding their little son, Aeneas, in her arms. With one hand, she clutched their child, and with the other, she grabbed Aeneas's knees, begging him not to go.
Please stay and protect us. Do not throw your life away. If you leave, take us with you so at least we can die together.
The family's argument about whether to leave or stay continued for some time. In the end, Anchises gave in and agreed to escape with them. They all prepared to flee the burning city. Meanwhile, the sounds of battle and shouting in the streets grew louder and closer. The fires were spreading, and new flames were lighting up the sky in different parts of the city. It was clear they had no time to lose. Aeneas quickly devised a plan. Anchises was too frail to walk through the city, so Aeneas decided to carry him on his shoulders. Aeneas would walk alongside him, holding his father's hand. Creusa would follow closely behind to avoid getting separated in the dark and chaotic streets. The household servants would escape via different routes to avoid attracting enemy attention. They would all meet outside the city at an old deserted temple near a tall, ancient cypress tree that would serve as their landmark. With this plan established, they immediately set out on their journey. Aeneas covered his shoulders with a lion's skin to make it easier to carry his father. Anchises carried the household gods, small sacred statues that represented divine protection. In those times, these were the most precious objects in a home, and saving them was a final act of devotion. Aeneas himself could not touch them because his hands were not purified after the battle, so Anchises took them instead. Holding Aeneas's hand, Aeneas led the way through the dark and ruined city, with Creusa following behind. The streets were gloomy, except for the occasional glow of fires burning in the distance. Flames lit up the tops of buildings, reflecting off towers and battlements, but most of the city was covered in deep shadows. Aeneas moved carefully, staying close to walls and hiding in narrow streets whenever possible. He was constantly on edge, fearing that a Greek soldier might suddenly appear and attack them, or a stray arrow or spear might strike Anchises or Creusa. If they were caught, he would not be able to fight since he was carrying his father and had no way to protect himself or his family. For a while, everything went smoothly. They avoided danger and hope grew that they might make it out alive. Just as they were approaching the city gate, believing they were almost safe, a sudden, loud commotion broke out nearby. A crowd of people rushed toward them, screaming in panic. The streets became chaotic, and among the people, Aeneas saw Greek soldiers approaching, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Anchises, terrified, shouted for Aeneas to run faster or find another way out. For a moment, Aeneas panicked. The noise, confusion, and rushing crowds made it impossible to think clearly. He ran in different directions, desperately looking for an escape route, but at every turn, people were fleeing in terror, blocking his path. Finally, after much struggle, he found a way out of the city. Breathing heavily, he kept running until he reached the meeting place on the hill. There, he gently set his father down and looked around. Creusa was nowhere to be seen. Aeneas was devastated when he realized that Creusa was missing. Overcome with grief and fear, he cried out in despair. But soon he reminded himself that this was a time for action, not sorrow. He quickly led his father and son to a hidden valley behind the hill, where they would be safe. Leaving them in the care of his servants, He rushed back to the burning city to find his wife. Before returning, Aeneas put on his full armor, determined to face any danger to rescue Creusa. He re-entered Troy through the same gate he had used to escape, carefully retracing his path through the ruins. The city was in chaos. Fires raged all around him, lighting up the dark streets as buildings collapsed into flames. He searched desperately, calling Creusa's name, but she was nowhere to be found. A thought struck him. Maybe she had gone back home, believing it to be the safest place. With one last hope, he hurried to their house, his heart pounding. When he arrived, his worst fear came true. His house was engulfed in flames. The surrounding buildings were burning, and the streets were filled with debris, furniture, and other belongings that people had tried to save before fleeing. Survivors stood nearby, watching helplessly as everything they owned was destroyed. Their faces were full of grief and terror. Aeneas frantically shouted Creusa's name, running through the crowds, begging for any news of her. But no one had seen her. Refusing to give up, he searched the city, running through the smoke-filled streets, stopping every familiar face, asking if they had seen his wife. But she was nowhere to be found. Then, suddenly, in a quiet part of the city, Aeneas stopped in his tracks. A ghostly figure stood before him. It was Creusa, but not as she had been in life. Her form was larger than before, her body shimmering like a spirit, and her face calm and peaceful. Aeneas instantly realized this was not the Creusa he knew. She was no longer alive. At first, he was terrified, but then Creusa spoke, her voice gentle and soothing.
My beloved husband, do not be afraid. Do not grieve for me. Everything that has happened was meant to be. It is not by chance that I could not escape with you. The gods have already decided my fate. You must not stay here searching for me. Your destiny is elsewhere. You will face many hardships and long years of wandering across land and sea. But in the end, you will reach a peaceful land on the banks of the Tiber River. There you will build a new kingdom, a new life, and a new bride awaiting for you there. So do not mourn for me. Instead, be glad that I did not fall into enemy hands and become a slave in Greece. I am free. Take care of our son, Ascanius. Love him for my sake. Protect him always. Farewell, my love.
As soon as Creusa's spirit finished speaking, she began to fade away. Desperate, Aeneas reached out to hold her, but his arms passed right through her. She was nothing but a shadow, unable to be touched. Before he could even speak, she was gone. Aeneas was left standing alone in the dark, empty street. At last, filled with sorrow and deep thought, he slowly turned away and made his way back to the city gates. From there, he headed to the hidden valley where he had left his father Anchises and his son Ascanius. When Aeneas arrived, he found them safe and waiting. He knew now that there was no future for them in Troy. The city was destroyed. It was time to leave forever. The group hid in the mountains for a few days, while Aeneas made plans to escape the land of Troy completely. Once the Greek invaders left, Aeneas and his men began building ships. In those days, ships were made for both rowing and sailing, so they prepared vessels that could handle long-sea voyages. While the work continued, small groups of surviving Trojans began arriving at Aeneas's camp. Some had been hiding in the hills and forests, and when they heard that the Greeks were gone, they came down. Others had managed to escape after the attack and were now looking for a new home. Little by little, Aeneas's group of followers grew, and so did the number of ships he built. By the time everything was ready, Aeneas had gathered a large group of survivors, a strong fleet of ships and warriors. At last, the day of departure arrived. The Trojans loaded their ships with as many supplies as they could carry. Then Aeneas, along with his father Anchises and his young son Ascanius, boarded the fleet. A favorable wind blew, and the ship set sail. As they drifted away from the shore, the men and women crowded the decks, looking back one last time. The land of Troy, their home and birthplace, was now just a burning ruin behind them. They knew they would never return. The first land within easy reach was Thrace, a country north of the Aegean Sea, just beyond the Hellespont. Aeneas steered the fleet northward, and after a short journey, they landed on the Thracian shore. He hoped to settle there, but a terrifying event forced him to leave quickly. After landing, the Trojans built an altar on the shore to give thanks for their safe journey. Aeneas wanted to decorate the altar with fresh branches, so he walked over to a nearby myrtle bush and began pulling up some green shoots. The moment he broke one from the ground, something horrifying happened. Blood began to drip from the roots. Dark drops of human blood oozed from the broken stem and fell onto the earth. Aeneas stared in horror, unsure of what he had just seen. Shaken, he whispered a prayer to the gods, asking them to protect him and explain this terrible sign. Still trembling, he reached for another branch and pulled it from the ground. This time, a deep, painful groan rose from beneath the earth. Then, a ghostly voice spoke.
"Stop. Do not disturb me. You are not pulling up a plant. You are hurting a man. I am Polydorus. The king of Thrace killed me, and my body was left here, unburied. I have turned into this myrtle tree."
Polydorus was the youngest son of King Priam of Troy. Years earlier, Priam had sent him to Thrace to be raised in the court of the Thracian king, providing him with gold and treasures to ensure he lived well. But when Troy fell and Priam was killed, the Thracian king saw an opportunity. He betrayed and murdered Polydorus to take his wealth. Aeneas and his men were horrified when they learned what had happened. It was clear that Thrace was not a safe place for them, so they decided to leave immediately. But first, they performed a proper funeral for Polydorus, believing it was the only way to let his soul rest. After completing the rites, they quietly boarded their ships and set sail once again. For months they wandered across the Mediterranean, searching for a new home. They faced storms, hardships, and strange encounters, constantly seeking guidance from oracles. At one of these sacred sites, they asked where they should go to settle. The oracle's response was cryptic: "Go to the land of your ancestors." Aeneas turned to his father, Anchises, for answers. Anchises believed their ancestors originally came from Crete, so they set their course for the island, hoping they had finally found their new home. When they arrived, things looked promising. They pulled their ships onto the shore, laid out plans for a city, planted fields, and started building homes. For a while, it seemed like they could finally settle in peace. Then disaster struck. A deadly plague spread through the settlement, killing many and leaving others weak and helpless. As if that wasn't enough, a severe drought followed, ruining their crops and threatening them with starvation. Their hopes of starting a new life in Crete quickly fell apart. Desperate to understand what had gone wrong, Anchises suggested returning to the oracle to ask if they had misinterpreted the prophecy. Maybe Crete wasn't the land they were supposed to find, or maybe they had unknowingly angered the gods. Aeneas agreed and planned to send messengers to seek answers. But before he could, something happened that changed everything. One night, Aeneas lay awake in his home, unable to sleep. His mind was filled with worry, thinking of ways to help himself and his people escape their struggles. The moonlight streamed through the window, shining on the household gods, the sacred statues he had saved from the flames of Troy. As he stared at them in the silence of the night, something incredible happened. One of the statues spoke to him.
We bring you a message from Apollo. You do not need to return to his temple to seek guidance. You made a mistake trying to settle in Crete. This is not the land meant for you. You must leave immediately and continue your journey. Your true destination is Italy, a distant land beyond vast and stormy seas. Do not lose hope. No matter how difficult the journey, you will reach Italy safely. There, you will establish a great empire that will one day rule many nations. Take courage and set sail again. Your destiny awaits.
Hearing this, Aeneas felt his strength and spirit return. He immediately prepared to leave. The half-built city was abandoned, and the fleet once again set sail. Aeneas and his people faced many dangers in the following months. A terrible storm raged for 3 days and nights, tossing their ships around like leaves. With no sun or stars to guide them, they drifted aimlessly, constantly on the verge of being swallowed by the waves. At another stop along their journey, they landed on a group of islands hoping to rest and find food. But their troubles were far from over. The islands were infested with harpies, giant, terrifying birds of prey with sharp claws and disgusting habits. Some stories described them as having the faces of women, while others said they were hideous, winged creatures. No matter how they looked, one thing was certain: they were ferocious and hungry. The harpies attacked without warning. They swooped down from the sky, stealing food from the Trojans' tables. They ripped apart supplies and snatched meat straight from the fire. They even clawed at the men, forcing them to defend themselves. Determined to fight back, Aeneas and his men grabbed their swords and waited in ambush. But the harpies were too fast, dodging every attack and escaping with their stolen food. Eventually, the Trojans had no choice but to flee the island. As they were leaving, the leader of the harpies perched on a high rock, watching them. In a human voice, she shouted curses at Aeneas and his people, mocking them as they sailed away. The journey was far from over, and many more challenges awaited them. Aeneas and his people spent a terrifying night near Mount Etna, where they had stopped to rest. In the middle of the night, the volcano erupted, spewing smoke, fire, and burning lava into the sky. The ground beneath them rumbled and roared, filling them with fear and awe. They believed that terrible monsters lived deep inside the mountain, feeding the flames and causing the eruptions. As soon as morning arrived, they hurried to escape from the frightening place. Later, they landed on a coast inhabited by one-eyed giants, huge, savage creatures who were known for their merciless cruelty. These giants were cannibals, grabbing men with their bare hands and smashing them against rocks before eating them. One of these monsters, Polyphemus, had trapped a group of men in his cave, intending to devour them one by one. However, while he was asleep, the prisoners managed to blind him by stabbing his single eye. They couldn't kill him. He was too enormous. But they escaped while he was helpless. As Aeneas and his crew sailed past the coast, they saw Polyphemus wading through the sea, trying to soothe his wounded eye. He used a massive pine tree as a walking stick, carefully feeling his way forward. After a long and difficult journey, filled with many dangers and adventures, Aeneas and his people finally reached the shores of Italy. This was the land that the gods had promised them, the place where they were meant to build a new home. Chapter 4. Where Rome Will Rise. Latium was an ancient region of Italy, located south of the Tiber River. When Aeneas arrived, it was an independent kingdom ruled by King Latinus. At that time, the land near the Tiber, where Rome would one day be built, was still a wild and undeveloped area. It was a landscape of hills, valleys, and forests, home to shepherds and farmers. There were no cities yet, just small settlements. The people of Latium were of Greek origin. and they had brought with them early knowledge of writing, simple music, weapons, and construction. They lived in wooden or stone houses, and their towns had walls and fortifications for defense. When Aeneas and his people arrived at the Tiber's mouth, they anchored their ships and finally set foot on land. After years of traveling, they hoped this would be their final home. The journey had cost them dearly. Many ships and men had been lost along the way. The remaining survivors longed for rest and stability. Soon after landing, some of the ships caught fire and burned. According to legend, it was the women of the group who set the ships ablaze, desperate to prevent another voyage and force Aeneas to settle in this new land. Regardless of how it happened, Aeneas was eager to stay. The land before him was beautiful and inviting. Open plains, green meadows, and groves filled with flowers. The distant mountains added to the charm of the landscape, and the warm golden light of the Italian sky made it seem like the perfect place to start anew. Wasting no time, Aeneas and his men set up camp along the shore. They built basic defenses for protection and prepared for possible dangers. Some men explored the river's channels by boat, likely to map the area and keep an escape route open in case of trouble. Others built altars and prepared sacrifices to honor the gods of the land, hoping for their favor and protection. Aeneas also sent out a scouting party to explore the interior of the country and make contact with the local people. This was the beginning of his efforts to claim Latium as his new home. The scouting party sent by Aeneas explored the land, following the banks of the river and traveling across the fields and plains. Everywhere they went, they found lush, green landscapes dotted with small villages and towns. They soon learned the name of the local king, Latinus, and the name of his capital city. At the same time, King Latinus received news about the arrival of these foreigners. At first, he considered attacking them immediately to drive them away from his land. However, after learning that they were exhausted and struggling, he hesitated. Their appearance and clothing suggested that they might be Greeks, a people well known across the world at that time, both feared and respected. This made Latinus uncertain. On one hand, he worried about the potential danger they posed. On the other, he felt a sense of pity for their suffering. Meanwhile, Aeneas decided to send a group of envoys to Latinus to explain why they had arrived with such a large number of people. He selected a group of men and gave them clear instructions on what to say. He also sent lavish gifts to offer the king as a sign of goodwill. These gifts included beautifully crafted weapons, gold and silver vessels, and embroidered garments, all common offerings used to gain favor in such situations. The envoys set off toward the capital of Latium. As they approached, they saw that the city was large and well fortified, with strong walls, towers, and battlements rising above the rooftops. Outside the gates, many people had gathered, not for battle but for sport and competition. Chariots raced around large circular tracks, with drivers pushing their horses to the limit. Horsemen showed off their skills, galloping at full speed. Athletes competed in running races. Archers and javelin throwers tested their accuracy and strength, either training for war or competing for prizes. The Trojan envoys stopped at a distance, waiting while a messenger went inside the city to inform King Latinus of their arrival. Latinus quickly decided to grant them an audience, and the envoys were escorted into the city. As they walked through the streets, they passed a large public building that served as the palace, senate house, and fortress all in one. The pathways leading to the entrance were lined with statues of great warriors and decorated with symbols of past victories. Inside, the Trojans saw war trophies from long-forgotten battles, old weapons, battered chariots, ship prows, helmets, and even massive iron bolts from the gates of conquered cities. Though these objects were now useless, they stood as reminders of Latium's military strength. Finally, the Trojan envoys were led into the presence of King Latinus, ready to explain their purpose and seek his favor. After the usual introductions, the Trojans delivered their message to King Latinus. They assured him that they had no hostile intentions and had not come to his land to cause war. They explained that they had lost their home, Troy, which had been completely destroyed. For years they had wandered across the seas, facing endless hardships and danger. They admitted that their arrival in Latium was not by chance. They had been divinely guided to this land. Prophecies had told them that Italy was meant to be their final home. Following these divine signs, they had set sail for the Tiber's shores, and now that they had finally arrived, they humbly asked for permission to settle in the land. Aeneas, their leader, requested that Latinus grant them a portion of his territory to build a new city and live in peace. King Latinus responded positively to the Trojans' request. He graciously accepted the gifts they had brought, gold, silver, fine garments, and weapons, and seemed pleased with their arrival. He had already heard rumors of Troy's fall and Aeneas's journey. Since the Trojans had been wandering for years, word of their struggles had spread across many lands. After some thought, Latinus agreed to Aeneas's request. He offered the Trojans land where they could build their city and formed an alliance with them. This friendly agreement was beneficial for both sides. One reason Latinus welcomed the Trojans so easily was that he was already at war with the Rutulians, a powerful tribe living south of Latium along the Italian coast. Latinus saw the Trojans as valuable allies who could help him fight his enemies. Aeneas agreed to support Latinus in this war in exchange for being allowed to settle in Latium. As a sign of even deeper unity, Latinus decided to offer his daughter, Lavinia, in marriage to Aeneas. Lavinia was his only child, known for her beauty and grace. This marriage would make Aeneas part of the royal family and secure his place in Latium. However, this decision created a serious conflict. Lavinia's mother, Queen Amata, had already promised her to Turnus, a young nobleman who had grown up in Latinus's court. Turnus was a strong warrior and a favored candidate to marry Lavinia and one day become king. But Latinus did not support this arrangement. He believed it would be better to give Lavinia to Aeneas, strengthening their new alliance. Aeneas gladly accepted. Lavinia's own feelings were not considered, as was the custom of that time. When Turnus learned that he had been rejected, he was furious. Feeling betrayed and humiliated, he left the court in anger, determined to fight for what he believed was his. This marked the beginning of a new conflict, as Turnus refused to accept Aeneas as Lavinia's husband and prepared for war against the Trojans. Aeneas and his followers finally seemed to have reached a place of safety and peace. They were now settled in a fertile land, with strong allies and a promising future. Eager to begin their new lives, they started building their city. At first, Aeneas wanted to name it Troy, in memory of their lost homeland. However, because of his upcoming marriage to Lavinia, he decided instead to name the city Lavinium in her honor. The land given to the Trojans by King Latinus was in southwestern Latium, near the coast. However, this also meant that it bordered the Rutulian territory. When Turnus left Latium, angry that Lavinia had been promised to Aeneas instead of him, he joined the Rutulians. In his rage, he convinced them to go to war and led their army across the border toward Lavinium. Suddenly, Aeneas and his people faced a serious new threat. As if facing Turnus and the Rutulians wasn't enough, another unexpected event caused even the Latins themselves to turn against Aeneas. Many of the common people of Latium had never truly accepted the Trojans. They saw them as foreigners who had taken their land, all because of the king's favor. Though they had kept their resentment hidden, it had only grown stronger over time. Finally, an unfortunate event made their anger explode into open conflict. In Latium, there was a man named Tereus, who was the king's chief herdsman. He lived on Latinus's land, caring for the royal flocks and cattle. Tereus had 2 sons and a daughter named Sylvia. One day, the 2 sons captured a young stag in the forest. It had been with its mother, but it was still very young, so they brought it home as a pet. They fed it with milk until it grew bigger, and because it was raised by hand, the stag became extremely tame and affectionate. It was a beloved animal in the family, and especially close to Sylvia. She spent her days bathing it in the fountain, combing its fur, and decorating it with wreaths and garlands. What started as a simple pet would soon become the reason for war. One day, Aeneas, the son of Aeneas, who had now grown into a young man full of energy and enthusiasm, was returning from a hunting trip. He carried his bow and arrows, and his hunting dogs ran ahead of him. As he passed near a small forest by a brook, his dogs suddenly caught the scent of Sylvia's pet stag. The gentle animal, unaware of the danger, had wandered away from Tereus's land to drink from the brook. The dogs rushed after it, barking loudly. Aeneas followed, quickly pulling an arrow from his quiver and taking aim with his bow. As soon as he saw the stag, he released the arrow, which struck the poor animal in the side, causing a deep wound. The stag, however, did not fall. Instead, it ran back home, bleeding heavily, leaving a trail of blood behind. It staggered into Sylvia's house, searching for safety, and collapsed in its resting place, filling the home with painful cries. When Tereus and his 2 sons realized that their beloved pet had been injured by Aeneas, they were furious. Their rage quickly spread to the nearby farmers and shepherds, who were already resentful of the Trojans. It did not take much to ignite their anger. The villagers grabbed whatever weapons they could find, clubs, torches, scythes, and rushed out, determined to take revenge. They saw the Trojans as arrogant outsiders who had no respect for Latium's people or traditions. At the same time, news of the attack reached the Trojan camp. A large group of young Trojan warriors quickly gathered to defend Aeneas. Both sides were angry and reckless, and before any wise leaders could calm the situation, a violent battle broke out. In the chaos, one of Tereus's sons, Almon, was killed. An arrow struck him in the throat, and he died instantly. Almon was still young, and his tragic death made the anger of the villagers even worse. Another Latin warrior was also killed. The fight eventually ended, but the damage was done. The furious villagers took the bodies of the dead and marched to Latinus's palace, demanding justice. They stood before their king holding the lifeless bodies and demanded war. Their message was clear. The Trojans must be driven back into the sea before more blood is spilled. Latinus struggled to control the growing anger of his people. He tried his best to calm the situation and prevent war, but the hatred toward the Trojans had grown too strong. Eventually, public opinion turned completely against Aeneas and his followers, leaving them isolated and surrounded by enemies. The leader of their foes was Turnus, who was determined to destroy Aeneas and reclaim Lavinia. Despite the growing danger, Aeneas did not lose hope. Realizing that he could not win alone, he left his city with a few trusted men to seek help from nearby rulers. Rivalry between neighboring kingdoms was common, and Aeneas knew that some of them might support him just to weaken Latium and the Rutulians. His efforts paid off. Several Italian princes agreed to ally with him, providing him with reinforcements and promising more troops. Encouraged by this, Aeneas returned to his city and prepared for war. The conflict soon erupted into full-scale war, with both sides fighting fiercely. The battles dragged on for a long time, with victories and losses on both sides. Latinus, now an older man, had little interest in glory or conquest. His daughter Lavinia was now married to Aeneas, meaning that his own family's future was tied to the Trojans. He watched the war with deep anxiety, but he felt powerless to stop it. He chose to wait for the right moment, hoping that, eventually, a chance would come to step in and bring peace. Over time, Aeneas and his forces began to gain the upper hand. Despite being outnumbered, they had several advantages. They fought as a single, united army, while their enemies were scattered over a wide region. They had no homes, farms, or herds to protect, so the enemy could not weaken them by raiding their lands. Whenever the Trojans won a battle, they took valuable supplies from their enemies. But when the Latins won, there was no reward, only the cost of lost soldiers. The Trojans were hardened by years of suffering, from the fall of Troy to their long and dangerous journey. This made them tough, determined fighters who refused to give up. As the war continued, the Latins and Rutulians began to struggle. Their once strong confidence weakened as they realized that Aeneas and his people were far tougher than they had expected. After a long and exhausting conflict, both sides grew weary of war. Sensing an opportunity, Latinus proposed peace talks with Aeneas. However, Turnus strongly opposed this idea. He wanted the war to continue, refusing to accept any compromise. Other Latins began to turn against Turnus. They blamed him for all the suffering the war had brought and argued that he had no right to drag the entire country into his personal feud. Instead of forcing others to fight for him, they said he should settle the dispute directly by challenging Aeneas to a duel. Latinus did not approve of this plan. He wanted the war to end completely and still hoped to make peace by marrying Lavinia to Aeneas, as he had originally intended. For a brief moment, Turnus hesitated, but when he looked at Lavinia, who stood nearby with her mother Amata, he thought he saw signs of love and support in her anxious expression. Believing she wanted him, not Aeneas, he quickly agreed to the duel. The duel was arranged, a final one-on-one fight between Turnus and Aeneas. Both armies gathered on the battlefield to witness the event. The ground was marked, and the combat began. At first, it was just the two warriors, but as often happens in such cases, others got involved. Small skirmishes broke out, and soon the duel erupted into a full-scale battle. The Trojans ultimately won, securing a decisive victory. Both Latinus and Turnus were killed in the battle. With their leaders gone, the Latins surrendered. The war was over. With peace restored, Aeneas married Lavinia and became the rightful ruler of Latium. From that moment on, he ruled the kingdom, laying the foundation for what would later become the Roman Empire. Aeneas lived for many years after these events, and is remembered for governing the kingdom wisely. He brought with him from Troy the knowledge and arts of the Greeks, which he shared with his people to greatly improve their lives. He also introduced many religious ceremonies that were common in the lands he had come from or visited during his long journey. Over time, these rituals became an important part of the religious practices in Latium, passed down from generation to generation. Later, through Roman literature, these customs became known and celebrated throughout the civilized world. Eventually, while fighting a war against the Rutulians, Aeneas found himself in extreme danger after a battle. To escape his pursuers, he tried to swim across a stream called Numicius, which flows into the sea just north of Lavinium. In ancient times, this stream must have been much larger than it is now. Modern travelers say that today it is just a small brook, nearly impossible to drown in. After Aeneas drowned, His Trojan followers hid his body and spread the story that he had been taken up to heaven. Since his people had long believed that their king was the son of a goddess, they began to see him as divine. They built altars in his honor throughout Latium and started to worship him as a god.